The lefties think that there are cultural differences and they're important, but if you ever talk about them in the wrong way, then you're racist. And the right-wingers, well, they just think there are ethnic differences to begin with. So it's a tricky issue. If there aren't differences that are important, then who the hell cares about multiculturalism? It's not even worth preserving. And if there are differences, well, then you're stuck with having to deal with the differences. So you're basically screwed either way. So anyways, Jung has been the target of many accusations of anti-Semitism, particularly by biographers who were resentful and clueless and historically uninformed and, I would say, malevolent, fundamentally. He worked as a CIA agent. It was just revealed last year, and he provided psychological reports to the American government on the underlying psychological structure of the Nazi leaders for years. And he never told anybody about that while he was alive. It only came to light, as far as I know, last year, or perhaps the year before that. So anyways, the Germans, you know, they weren't very happy about the whole damn situation. And so when they were aggregating en masse, you think, well, what happens when all people get together in a group? You know, we talked about that last time when we talked about Kierkegaard's idea that as soon as you get a bunch of people together, no matter how truthful they are all as individuals, instantly the crowd is not a truthful thing. And, you know, there are real reasons for that, real psychological reasons. So there's the famous Asch experiments. I hope that those are the right experiments, A-S-C-H, about line length, you know. So you draw two lines on the board and they're the same length, and you get the crowd to, you know, collaborate with you, and you ask some poor sucker who doesn't know about the game to play, and, you know, you ask one person and they say, no, those lines are different in length. And you ask another person, they say, well, yeah, they're quite different in length. And another person says, yeah, sure, I can see the difference in length. And then you ask the poor pigeon, you know, are they different in length? And he says, yes, you know, and you can understand why. It's like, if all those other people are saying it, there's either something wrong with all of them, which seems unlikely, or he's the victim of a conspiracy, which is a little on the paranoid side, but happens to actually be true in this case, or he's just not looking at it right. And you might think, well, the humble thing to think is he's wrong. And so, you know, the fact that somebody might go along with the crowd, you know, you can blame that on their ability to be social and conventional, which in many ways is a huge advantage, because if you are all antisocial and unconventional, you know, I mean, there'd be a good chunk of you in jail, and we certainly wouldn't be having this, you know, delightful, peaceful conversation that we're having. So, you know, you don't want to underestimate the utility of conventionality to too much of a degree. Anyway, so there's this funny story I read once. I don't think it's true, but it might be, where a psychology class got together and decided they'd play a trick on the professor. And the trick was that he would walk back and forth, and the trick was that they wouldn't pay any attention to him at all if he was on the left side of the room. You know, they'd talk a bit and look up. And if he was on the right side of the room, then they'd really focus in and pay attention. And the story goes that by several weeks of this little trick, they had him like lecturing right beside the door, you know, and he wouldn't move from that spot. And so the reason I'm telling you that is because it's pretty obvious that people can respond to the cues that a crowd is delivering. So that's another reason why you should be careful what you say, and why you say it, you know, and why you're looking for attention, and all of those things, and actually what's motivating you, and actually what's motivating the people who are listening to you. Because God only knows where it might go if you're not careful. Well, actually, we do know where it goes if you're not careful. And it's not pretty, that's for sure. And to think that we've learned anything from that, it's like, no, that's not right. We haven't learned a damn thing from it. So, because we don't want to understand it. Now, these guys were all concerned with that sort of thing. They were highly concerned with it. Now, Binswanger and Boss had both been influenced by Freud and by Jung. You can see in the bottom right-hand corner there, that's Boss with Jung, and that's Binswanger on the left and Boss at the top there. So, you know, they're pretty thoughtful looking guys, and they were pretty damn smart. And they were quite philosophically oriented, and they had both studied Heidegger and they'd both studied Husserl, who were German philosophers. Heidegger actually got tangled right up into the Nazi movement, and, you know, his philosophy has been cast under a cloud of suspicion, perhaps a well-deserved cloud of suspicion, as a consequence of his cooperation with the Nazis. So it wasn't only stupid people who got tangled up in this, it was pretty much everybody who got tangled up in it. And one of the things you might think about, and this is worth thinking about, is that if you were there, for any one of you, there's a 90% chance that you would have got tangled up in it. You know, you wouldn't have been the person who rescued the gypsies. It's like, forget that. It's like, unless you think that, you know, you're heroic far beyond the average, and I would be very, very careful about assuming that. You could assume instead that you would have been swept along with the crowd just like everyone else, because everyone else was. I mean, Stalin starved 6 million people to death in the Ukraine in the 1930s, and he was just warming up. You know, I don't know how many of you have heard of the Ukraine famine? How many of you haven't? Yeah, well, think about that. You know, how many of you knew Mao killed 100 million people? How many of you didn't? Yeah, well, you might think about why you don't know that. You know about the damn Nazis, but you don't know about the horrors that the communists perpetrated. It's worth thinking about why. Because the communists, especially the Maoists, man, those people were brutal. You can't just damn one structure and think the others are going to, you know, it's like the right-wingers, they're always on about big government, how terrible that is, and the left-wingers are always on about how big corporations are terrible. It's like, well, big is terrible. It doesn't matter if it's government or corporations, because things tend to tilt towards corruption across time, and that has to be taken into account. But anyway, so the Freudians and the intellectuals and the Marxists were all pretty happy when the religious dream started to come apart, and they believed that the new edifices that they were going to construct, fascist and communist, would be so much better than what they replaced that, you know, everybody would be drowning in utopia. And it's kind of too bad that isn't how it turned out. But it's certainly not how it turned out. How it turned out was, sometimes when you tear something down, even if you think it's terrible, you end up constructing something on its ruins that makes the previous terrible look like the work of rank amateurs. And that's certainly what happened in the 20th century. I mean, no matter what you say about the Catholic Church and its basic barbarism, especially when, you know, they were involved in the witch hunt in the Middle Ages, it's like, those guys, they were amateurs compared to the fascists and the communists. You know, they were counting their victims in the tens of thousands, not the hundreds of millions. Oh, careful observers like George Orwell had pretty much figured out by the late 30s that not all was right in the paradise of Stalin. But, you know, people thought he was a right-winger and didn't listen to him much, even though he was a left-winger. So these existential phenomenologists, they're trying to figure out, okay, we got a big problem here. The belief systems are seriously going sideways. And there's some indication, you know, there's some individual responsibility for that, of some indeterminate nature. Like, if you live in a country where everyone's turned into a fascist murderer, like, is that your fault? Well, you know, it's not obvious that an individual should be held responsible for the actions of an entire country, but then again, the country's made up of individuals, so it's a very difficult problem to solve.